Hi, friends. Welcome back to the Skinny on Wall Street with us, the Wall Street Skinny. I'm Kristin.
I'm Jen.
And today we are going to do a quick the skinny on and talk about some of the biggest topics that are in the markets today. Well, it's really almost like the almost political conversation because so much of what's happening in politics obviously seeps into the markets. So big things that are happening. Last week, Donald Trump made two announcements that kind of, I would say, the finance world reacted to. So number one, he put out a tweet or a truth or whatever you want to call it about wanting companies to go from filing quarterly earnings to semi-annual earnings, which I mean, I think most people are like, are you kidding me? Who cares? But it was like exploding head emoji for anyone who's in like the fin meme world. And initially, I think I was telling you, Jen, like my reaction was like, what now? But eventually when I was thinking about it, I was like, okay, this actually makes a little more sense. So we are going to talk about what the pros and cons are because there are it's not like, oh, it's all good or oh, it's all bad. It's like there's pros and cons depending on how you look at it. The second thing we want to talk about is also Donald Trump signed an executive order basically saying that for anyone who wants, or I should say companies who want to apply for H-1B visas for their employees, they have to pay $100,000 every single year for like 6 years or something to sponsor those visas. And so those are the types of visas that are used at banks. Like that is what, if you are a JP Morgan, a Morgan Stanley, or if you're getting a job, if you're international and you're getting a job offer to go be like, say like an analyst or an associate at Morgan Stanley or whatever, you are usually going to be getting one of those types of visas. And so this is actually, again, a huge deal for these banks. And so we want to talk about the potential pros, cons, and again, like what has been, again, the reaction to this. And then finally, there was like literally 7 minutes before we hit record, there was some article about the Dallas Fed president who was talking about wanting to, or thinking that we should change, no longer looking at Fed funds effective and instead looking at SOFR or general collateral or something. So Jen's going to explain this to me because obviously this is not my area of expertise. I always learn from Jen, so which is so much fun. And speaking of learning from Jen, can you talk about what we have coming up next week? Because I'm so excited.
Guys, if you have not signed up yet, you need to go drop everything. Don't even listen to this podcast episode. I'm just kidding. And sign up for our free live masterclass that is happening on Tuesday, September 30th at 12 p.m. Eastern. And you can register at the link in our show notes. And this is going to be an hour with me. I am walking you through effectively the top 5 technical concepts, but it's way more than 5, let's be honest, because you guys know I can't shut up. And we're going to walk through everything you need to know for either your fixed income sales and trading interviews that I know you guys are doing if you are going to be interviewing for your internships, your full-time jobs, all that fun stuff. If you are looking to get a job or have just started in asset management or at a hedge fund, you got to know this stuff. And if you're a novice investor or just someone who wants to understand what the heck your friends are talking about when they talk about the markets, this is for you.
And it's for all of you
in bonds.
I was going to say, and it's for anyone who wants to go into investment banking, corporate advisory. I don't care. Like you need to understand what's going on in the markets because this is what I did not have as a corporate finance, like a investment banking analyst. And like, I would have been so much smarter and better at my job if I actually understood this shit.
Yeah, so I'm really excited. I'm also nervous as hell. I have never spoken. There's over 1,000 of you registered. I've never spoken in front of that many people. I've never spoken in front of more than I think 100 people. So I'm extremely nervous. So please come watch me make a fool out of myself. It's going to be so much fun. It's going to be it's the two of us. You guys know what this is like. If you've ever done one of Kristin's master classes, it's going to be that, only a hot mess because it's me. So
no, it's not. It's going to be
really,
so
really
good.
Fun. And this is material that we've never covered for you guys live on the air before. And we have some special announcements that we're going to be doing while we're there. And we're going to have a free giveaway for everyone who's live. So if you can't make it live, still register. You'll get a free 48-hour replay. But if you can make it live, you'll be eligible to win some fun stuff. So it's going to be really, really cool.
Yay. I'm so excited. And by the way, Jen has been working so hard on this. So please show up. Like it is going to be amazing.
It'll be a party. We'll
play some music
at the beginning. Yeah, we'll play some music.
Awesome.
It'll be fun. And you guys get to ask questions live on the air, which is going to be awesome.
Yeah. So with that, let's dive in and let's talk about the H-1B.
Yeah, exactly. This is something that impacts so many people globally. So, Kristin, you're more
Yeah.
familiar with this than I. I was like frantically listening to some podcasts to try to even understand. I know very, very little about like the immigration process, about visas. I think our conversation with Go Buy Side was one of the
Mm,
first conversations that I'd ever had about what that
yeah.
process was like. Even though it's funny because we've had a lot of J-1 visas living in our home because we'd had au pairs over the years.
Yeah.
I knew nothing about H-1B visas until we had that very preliminary conversation. And now the entire landscape of how people get jobs in America is changing. So I'd love if you could talk our listeners through a little bit about what the news is and what happened.
Well, yeah, I want to back up a little bit because I sometimes think it can be helpful to understand almost in the context of a little bit of a story. So, when I joined Morgan Stanley in 2007, I remember like this, by the way, was the height of the credit boom. And at the time, if you were international, getting an H-1B visa was not easy. And so the thing is in the analyst class that you typically, historically would come in with, there is going to be a lot of international students. And so I had a ton of friends who needed to get that H-1B visa. And at the time, again, it was very difficult to get because the H-1B system, it's a lottery system. So it's like you apply for a visa, maybe you get it, maybe you don't. It's like you're basically, whatever. It's drawing pieces of paper and you either get it or you don't. But it really is a function of how much demand is there. And so obviously in 2007, I mean, shit was crazy. Everything was great, like popping champagne. And so there were tons of jobs, which meant that there was just a much lower chance that you would get a visa because there's so many people that needed them. Now, then in 2008, there was the global financial crisis, right? And I'm going to just put a pin. We're not going to talk about sort of the TARP money and how things got affected there because there was this little blip on the radar where because the banks were given the government TARP money, they actually then were like going to be not eligible for a while. But anyway, whatever, banks paid back all that money, especially, your Morgan Stanleys, your Goldmans, et cetera. And so then in the sort of 2009 timeframe when people started to apply for these visas, you basically got it because there was just not a lot of demand for those visas because there weren't a lot of jobs. So anyway, the point is that the H-1B visa is something that these banks rely on quite heavily. So this is the type of visa that very highly skilled workers, typically in like your tech, your finance, your medicine, those are the types of people that are getting these visas. Now, fast forward to today. And so President Trump came out in, I guess to your point, over the weekend and said that he wanted to change the way that these H-1B visas are given so that if you want to apply for one, you have to pay a $100,000 fee for new entrants. And existing holders, I guess, like they're exempted, but I'm not sure if they're exempted from the actual cost. You might know more about that. But
it's going to be $100,000 every year for up to 6 years before then you're no longer even eligible for this visa.
So would existing holders have to start paying
I don't know
in
if they're
next year?
subject to the renewal requirements, but my guess is yes. I do not know though.
So this becomes obviously like a huge issue for people who are international studying here in the United States and want to get a job on Wall Street. Now, the thing is, and this is like I said, in 2007, amongst my friends who were in my analyst class, because literally like most of them did not get those visas, what ultimately happened is they just like went to other offices. It was like kind of not a big deal. They all would be like, I'm getting deported to London. I'm getting deported to Hong Kong. And they kind of joked about it. And they would go off and they would work, for a year in an international office. Then they would apply again for a slightly different visa. And they would come back into the in the New York office and they would basically work here because there are other types of visas. And
that visa specifically, I believe, is the L1 visa, which is an intra-company transferee. So that's someone who has an established work history in, say, the London office, the Tokyo office, the Singapore office, and then transfers internally within that firm to the US.
Yeah. So that was what happened. Again, it wasn't really a big deal and banks kind of just rolled with the punches. And so what this kind of to me signals is that this is not a huge deal, I assume. And again, obviously there's a lot of things that we don't know. We are not legal experts. And so it's definitely possible that like there is something in here that we get wrong. But our understanding is that, and my guess is that this is not going to like hugely impact the sort of international banks because they'll do what they have always done, which is like they send off those people who are international students, they go off to XYZ office and then they come in with a different visa program or they stay there, by the way. So, but what it does hamstring is the companies that are mostly based in the United States, right? So the companies that don't have that international presence. And, I am more worried about almost like the impact on like medicine and some of the
research
universities,
institutions.
exactly, and like the tech startups, right? And this is sort of the cynical take from what I've heard, is that this was instituted after President Trump had, I think, like a dinner with all the tech executives who were complaining, because my guess is that it's actually really hard for them to hire like the person they want to pay $100 million, like, Facebook like tried to poach these AI crazy talented people, and they're getting I assume they're getting hired through that same H-1B visa program, although maybe not, because there is like the Einstein visa program, which apparently
Well, and now
Melania
there's
Trump.
there's like the gold card visa. So
That
now
too.
there's another visa where you can pay $1 million, or your employer can pay $2 million to get you into the U.S. for that.
Right.
Like, again, the person you were paying $100 million to, what's an extra million on that contract?
Right. But I do think that there was a little bit of almost, if you think about the types of people that potentially, like your Googles or whoever, that they're trying to bring in, even if it's $1 million and you have to pay 100,000 feet, like that's kind of a rounding error for the new hires, right? Who are, the investment banking analysts. I mean, when $100,000 is your salary, and sure, you might get like a 50,000 bonus, like that's a significant chunk of money that these banks are not going to want to pay. So I do think for, say, banking, it's going to ultimately lead to more American students getting hired again at the sort of US based firms. Now, I personally, look, I know this might sound crazy. Like, I'm not super worried about that from the perspective of like, there's so many people that are interested in applying. I don't know how much it's going to hurt from the talent perspective, but there is then the argument that like, I don't know, when there are really smart people who are around you, it kind of just ups your game. It's like you want to play with the best. So I'm not sure that it's necessarily a great move to be like, we're going to we're going to like reduce the competition for these jobs. So I don't know. I'm kind of torn on the impact to like the financial services firms, but I am very worried about what it means for, again, to your point, Jen, the impact on the smaller tech startups and medicine research, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts.
No, the argument that I had heard in favor of this, and this isn't necessarily saying that this is my personal view, but one thing I thought was interesting is that the statistics that I had heard was that the average salary of someone who's here on an H-1B visa is $66,000. So when I think about that, that's not
investment banking.
Investment banking, right? That is what I think of for like underpaying people in tech roles and underpaying people in IT and support roles in kind of the knowledge economy. So hearing that, it sounds to me like it's been de facto a way to import cheap labor and pay people less than the fair market wage for the value of their role, whether it be in building your tech company or building your investment bank, right, on the backs of people who are, doing all the work in operations and back office and middle office, and not paying them necessarily as much as they are potentially worth if you weren't able to get that labor from overseas that's willing to accept a lower dollar amount. So the kind of maybe potential light at the end of the tunnel is that we do get a rise in wages as ultimately that cheap labor goes away. And so much of the lack of wage inflation that we've heard from young people in the industry who are complaining about, the high cost of living in these cities and whose wages haven't increased, employers will effectively need to increase the wages that they are paying in this environment if they aren't able to import that relatively cheap labor for those entry-level jobs. So that's like the potential benefit to a plan like this that I could see for our industry.
I don't know. I don't know how much I buy that. I just think it's going to cause a lot more of those types of jobs to just be like offshored even more than they already are. I don't think that they're
already very much the case.
So
less so in tech, but I can't speak to tech. But in banking,
and I'm also curious, like that 66,000, does that include stock options and like award and like equity? Because a lot of people that are interested in like going to work for a startup or what have you, it's to get, the potential upside. So I would be curious, like how that gets sliced and diced, because $60,000, honestly, like that's less than you pay a nanny in New York City. Like people who are working in, not the knowledge economy are being paid more than that. So I'm kind of shocked that it's that low. Because by the way, you could literally go be like a babysitter and make more money than that. So that just seems shocking.
And not pay taxes on your tips.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So anyway, in New York, I would expect that number is higher, but I obviously
Well,
could
it's
be
the
wrong.
average nationally, so I don't know how it shakes out on either end. But I
And look, I
agree,
mean,
it's
I also,
shockingly
but
low given the
and I
qualifications that you need to obtain an H-1B visa.
actually, well, but I also think there's a lot of residents that are on that, again, like in the medical fields, and they are paid. That's basically what
They're
they are
not paid
paid.
anything. Yeah.
Yeah. So I do think that, again, it's some of the almost like structural things, like your residents who are on those visas being literally, I mean, I think if you're in New York City, a resident gets paid like $70,000. So it's literally like you get paid nothing. So I'm not surprised. I don't think though that, unfortunately changing this visa program isn't going to change how much they get paid. This actually has to do with like a Medicare, Medicaid situation. So
Mm-hmm.
anyway, I mean, I hear you, but I feel like I am very surprised at that number. And I do wonder what goes into that, because it just sounds like that is not it seems like that number is very surprising.
Yeah.
So
So, I mean, listen, again, not an immigration law expert. Would love to hear from you guys if you feel like you've been impacted. We're really just starting like the next round of, we've got a couple of full-time hiring processes going on here in the fall for firms that are saying, okay, here's where we are after summer analyst programs and after summer associate programs. What spots do we still need to fill? And we're heading into now that summer intern recruiting process that starts for people who are in their sophomore year, starting to apply for their junior year investment banking internship. So thinking about that calendar, right? We're talking
yeah.
about summer 2027 already. If you were someone who is here in the country who is thinking about what that means for you long term, we're really curious to hear from you as to how that's maybe potentially impacting your thoughts about your internship process in your career.
Yeah. I mean, my guess is it's going to mean that a lot of people that are international are going to be clamoring even more for the roles at banks that have that international presence. So, and I also think it gives, like I said, those banks the almost leg up that they can get the best of the best. And not that, not that Americans aren't the best, but I did hear someone who made the point that it's like, if you think about people the US almost is like the football team that has like the first draft pick. People want to come here, or they have historically. So it's like we are getting the best of the best from India, from China, from all these different countries who like see it as the stamp of approval to study at an American university and then like live in America and work at these types of roles. So, if you're an American here, you are competing against the best of the best from like all around the world, which again, if you're an American, that like I do see like that does kind of suck if you're trying to get that banking job. But at the same time, from just like the innovation economy, from like what's good for the US, having people come here and sort of like up the ante to like make sure,
We believe
make
in a
everybody.
meritocracy, right?
Yeah.
I don't want to get the job just because no one else was eligible who wasn't around. I mean, like, it makes me lazy and it makes my job easier, but like, I just believe so firmly in those principles of meritocratic hiring. And so if all of a sudden the applicant pool, if you take away the, 10 of the best candidates or whatever, okay, well, it's easier for a dummy like me to go get the job.
Well, yeah. So anyway, so curious to hear what you guys think. And as I said before, to me, I care less about what happens to like the banks. But I do think I am concerned about what happens to medicine. I've had a few friends who are doctors who have said the same thing. There is this like national shortage in the US of basically doctors, and we do have a lot of doctors that come from abroad. So I do think that is something just to keep an eye on. So the second thing we wanted to talk about is last week, Trump put this tweet out, which said, subject to actually, sorry, it was on Truth Social. It was not a tweet, but same difference. So he put out this truth that said, subject to SEC approval, companies and corporations should no longer be forced to report on a quarterly basis, quarterly reporting exclamation mark, but rather to report on a 6-month basis. This will save money and allow managers to focus on properly running their companies. Do you ever hear the statement that China has a 50 or 100-year view on management of a company, whereas we run our companies on a quarterly basis? Not good! Exclamation point, exclamation point, exclamation point. So when I first saw this, I was like, say what now? But it's funny, when I started to think about it, it actually made a little bit more sense. And so I think that it's important to understand the SEC rules that you have to report 4 times a year, where this came from. Like, so out of like the market crash, like the Great Depression of 1929, Congress created the SEC. And the basic philosophy is they wanted to like standardize disclosure, and they wanted investors to basically have as much transparency as possible. And so by like the 1960s, quarterly reporting became mandatory. And it's important to note that, like, if you think about the United States, like, we have the largest base of investors in the world, and like the size of our markets is much larger than other countries' markets. And so this is why I would argue it's actually relatively important to maintain, transparency. But what's interesting is that internationally, like, that is not the rules. And so if you're ever trying to model out like a international company, they actually only report usually twice a year. Now, technically, so in the US, we have US GAAP, which stands for Generally Accepted Accounting Principles, and then internationally, they have IFRS. Now, IFRS says you have to report once a year, but there's also like the local rules. And Europe does say that companies have to report what's called a semi-annual report, or what is it called? Yeah, a semi-annual report, where 6 months after the annual, they give an update. So again, big picture, right? Internationally, they report twice a year, and then domestically report 4 times a year. But so the main takeaway, though, is Trump was not so concerned about investors. He's more concerned about the companies. And I will say there is an argument that we should make things a little bit easier on companies. Like, regulatory shit is a pain in the ass. Jen, you and I were like trying to even just like file our stupid like taxes. I had to file an annual report in Massachusetts, and like, oh my God, I was on the phone with Delaware and with Massachusetts for literally like 2 days. And it turned out that I had like done something, I filed something correctly, and like they just never freaking updated it. Anyway, like, I totally get wanting to have less regulation on companies. And by the way, we are looking at a situation where we don't have enough public companies, I would argue, anymore. Like, the number of public companies has dropped so significantly. In 1996, there was 8,000 public companies, and today there's only 4,000. So companies are like not going public, because I feel like they're probably like, why the hell would I? Especially because nowadays, like, you can have liquidity through private markets, right? So you think about like an OpenAI, they're basically able to sell in and out of equity all the time. If you're like a employee and you need to cash out, you have ways to do so that don't require you to go, take the company public. So potentially, by making the regulations that you only have to report twice a year, maybe it increases the chance that companies go public. I will add, the other thing is that if you think about just what it takes when a company has to report earnings, it does increase like the cost and distraction. So like, management teams are spending a lot of time almost like distracted by like needing to do their quarterly updates, and like, what are they going to say in their earnings call, and putting together investor presentations. Like, there's a lot that goes into that does take them out of almost the flow of actually running the business. And on top of that, you also have the problem that sometimes, again, to the point that Donald Trump did make, when you are thinking about trying to almost like show what you can do on the short-term basis, you sometimes do it at the expense of the long term. And I actually would look at it almost like, look what just happened with like the big, beautiful bill, right? You had the government where they're like, we want to make sure that the next 4 years look great. Like, who cares about what happens to the deficit long term? But the next 4 years, we're going to be like gangbusters. And then like long term, that's somebody else's problem. So I actually agree with some of these arguments, but there's this two different sides, right? There is the companies, and then there is the investors. And so I will say that from the investor standpoint, I don't necessarily think it's great for investors if they do have that change, because we were talking actually to someone who's and to sort of come up with how we thought about this, we did talk to both someone who was at one of the big four accounting firms, as well as someone who was like the global head of research at a major bank. And both of them were concerned about increased volatility in the stock market, because as you get that less transparency, it's almost like the quality of the most recent report becomes less and less relevant. And so then with each new report, right, each new semi-annual report, now all of a sudden you're getting new information, and like,
you
it's like,
more new information.
Exactly. Yeah. There's also the argument that it could potentially like encourage more misconduct, because like you can sort of do bad stuff like in the shadows, and then people aren't going to be able to see it as easily. And I also would argue that the argument about the sort of like long-term horizon, I don't think that carries as much weight. The reason is, I will say, private equity firms buy companies, and oftentimes it is helpful to be out of the public view for, call it 5, 6, 7 years, to sort of massively change strategy. That is absolutely true. But I would argue that going from reporting 4 times a year to 2 times a year is not enough to move the needle. Just like, I used this analogy with you before, Jen. If you're a congressperson and you are so worried about like getting reelected every 2 years, if all of a sudden you now have to get reelected after every 3 years, you still are really focused on that. And so the point is, going from 4 times to 2 times, I don't think is enough to move the needle to have companies really focus on like long term. I would say you really kind of almost like have to go private, which is actually back to the problem we have initially, which is like too many private companies and not enough public companies. So anyway, that's where I fall out on this. I think that there is an argument that you should do it to help smaller companies. And so maybe I don't know, happy medium is companies that are part of the S&P, like part of these massive indexes that people are buying into all the time. And there's tons of, again, retail investors who are buying in, that they should have to report. Because by the way, a lot of retail investors, like they can't just call up, whatever, XYZ Bank Research and get a meeting with the CEO of the company that they're invested in. So they don't have the ability of the institutional investors, like I said, to sort of be up to date with what's going on the way that institutional investors do. So I don't think that companies that are part of these large indices should necessarily move to the twice a year, but I could see an argument for the small companies who are not part of those major indices, who, maybe it encourages these smaller firms to go public. So anyway, I don't know. I'm curious to hear what your thoughts are, Jen.
Well, next week, we're going to be talking to a wonderful writer who wrote a book about operational efficiency at companies. And one of the stories that they shared in the book was actually a company that had literally boxes of cereal on train cars. And in order to meet a specific deadline to artificially improve their numbers, they moved those train cars over state lines so they could meet a deadline and say that they shipped out the product, and then moved them right back across the state line right after the deadline for reporting had passed, so that they had a huge negative impact in the next quarter. So the idea that this is going to protect us from wrongdoing, I think is a little bit outdated and anachronistic, that like quarterly reporting is the only thing standing between us and the most nefarious actors. I think that pressure to constantly be like focused on like, what's the next result? What's the next? I just think about if you and I had to do something quarterly, like forget it, right?
Oh,
It would
yeah.
just be,
yeah.
So as a small business owner, I can completely relate to businesses wanting to reduce the frequency of that reporting, or at least the onerousness of it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, hey, listen, every couple months you do some basic box ticking exercise, right? And then save that giant annual report for the big information, but let's reduce the amount of requirements for the quarterly reports rather than just eliminating them altogether. I think that would be if that's truly the spirit and intention, right, to keep people focused on long-term results, then let's figure out what the bare minimum is that you could cover in a quarterly report and get there.
Well, right? To be fair, there is not a lot that is covered in the quarterly. I mean, so just to give you a sense, the annual report, if it's 100 pages, the quarterly report is maybe 15. So it is a much skinnier version than the annual report. But to your point, they still do have the press conference. They still do have the earnings calls with the research analysts. And you still have the
metrics. Like you still have all the data points that go into those metrics.
Yeah.
And you don't want those metrics to look bad because of the valuation implications.
Yeah.
So if you kept some of those metrics quiet and left a little bit more to like, hey, let's give, and again, you have seasonal impacts quarterly. Like everybody knows that, but like, you're still trying to be like, look, but we beat the seasonal impact, right? Like the wind didn't impact us, whatever it is. I think that I could easily see an argument for wanting to make those reporting requirements less onerous with no nefarious intention behind it.
No, but I think I think that the point was that the fact that you have to do the quarterly reporting reduces the potential fraud. Like it's not going to get rid of it entirely.
But
I will say the other potential downside is like one of the things that is helpful. So like if you're looking at quarterly balance sheets, you can see the actual swings in working capital in a way that you're not going to be able to see as well through the less through like only by whatever twice a year. We talked about this buy versus semi. I cannot. We'll never master that.
It's half a circle.
I know. But so I think that do I think Apple and Microsoft and NVIDIA should have to report quarterly? I do. Do I think that XYZ, like little baby company with 100 employees, like, no, I think maybe like let them be, like, let them go public, but like, maybe like, take down the onerousness. The only reason that I am very, very biased against not wanting them to change this is I finished all the accounting videos and I do not want to have to re-record those. So if it wasn't for my accounting videos, I'd be like even more in favor of it. But anyway, for the small companies, I think there is an argument that you should potentially move to the twice a year. So with that, Jen, can you talk a little bit about what's going on with like that Fed governor and what she said
so,
and the SOFR versus Fed funds?
The president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas just made headlines saying that she thinks we should do away with the Fed funds target rate and replace it effectively with what you can really think of as SOFR. So I'll explain that a little bit.
Is that Bowman or is that someone else?
No, this is who was it? Logan.
I always view this a little bit from the political lens.
She's not a current voting member, but she is slated to become so in 2026. And I never looked at this through the political lens. So and by the way, funny that that's how your whole framework for thinking about the Fed is oriented.
Well, like I said, things become more interesting and when they break and get political. But just to remind people, so with the FOMC, you have the Fed governors who always vote, and then you have the rotating presidents. And so the presidents, the only one that votes every single year is the New York president, and the remainder like rotate. So this year you have 4 that are voting. They're going to roll off and a new crop of 4. So the Dallas one will be one of the new crop of 4 that's going to be voting in next year. So just adding that lovely little context.
Well, the president of the Dallas Fed came out and said that effectively we should do away with the Fed funds target rate range applying to the federal funds rate. That's not the best tool for implementing monetary policy, that we should instead look to something called the tri-party general repo rate. You don't need to know what that is or worry about that. But if you've ever heard me talk about the general collateral rate, at which basically one borrower can make a collateralized or can take out a collateralized loan from a lender, right? So it's a loan of cash collateralized by really high quality collateral like US Treasuries. That's the general collateral rate. And the way that that's actually done, the way that those loans are made is through something called a repurchase agreement. We don't need to get into the mechanics of them here. It will be over too many people's heads. And to be honest, even when you teach this stuff at a bank, you're like, it's a loan collateralized by a bond. Okay. You don't need to think about the mechanics of actually like selling the bonds and buying them back and vice versa. Just think about it as a loan, a very short-term loan that happens all day, every day, to effectively fund levered longs and shorts in the markets, right? People are going out and you're saying, hey, listen, if I want to buy $100 million worth of bonds, you're not necessarily deploying $100 million worth of cash as a bank. You're saying, all right, I'm going to borrow $100 million. I'm going to go take that cash, buy a bunch of bonds, then to turn around and pledge those bonds as collateral for that loan. And that's how I continue all day, every day to invest in the market, right? And the interest rate on that loan, on that very short-term overnight loan, is the general collateral rate. So what this Fed governor is saying is that those observed repurchase agreements that are happening all day, every day, that are collateralized loans, that is really the measure of funding stress in the market. That looking at how much people need to pay to finance those positions, that's what we care about most. And that's the best indicator of how monetary policy is being transmitted into the system. That these uncollateralized loans, which is what effectively the Fed funds effective rate is measuring, between banks is not really any meaningful indicator of stress in the system. The Fed funds effective rate just basically almost never moves, whereas GC moves all the time. And GC is the input that we use in the secured overnight funding rate, SOFR, that is the funding curve for interest rate derivatives and for basically every derivative out there. So because that's so much more deeply tied to all of our systems for accounting for interest rates across not just funding a cash treasury holding position or funding what it takes to buy a corporate bond as a funded position, but also all interest rate derivatives, all credit default swaps, all derivatives or whatever, we care much more about that general collateral rate than we do about the unsecured Fed funds effective rate. I mean, we're really splitting hairs here in terms of these very short-dated instruments, but she is not the first to have made this argument. Chamath on the All In podcast has been calling for it because, listen, we got rid of LIBOR. LIBOR used to be it was the London interbank offered rate, and that was every single morning there would be a panel of the member banks in London, and everyone would say, okay, guys, where do you think you could borrow and lend to each other for a week, a month, 6 months, 9 months, a year, right? And they'd all submit their decisions to this panel, and that would determine then the interest rate settings for trillions and trillions and trillions, if not quadrillions worth of dollars of global fixed income instruments. We got rid of that and said, listen, we want something that's based on empirical data. We want to know where transactions are actually happening so that no one can manipulate this rate. So we came up with SOFR, and it's a measure of GC. So the question is why aren't we using those same metrics to also determine how monetary policy is being transmitted through to everyone on an everyday basis, rather than this kind of obscure Fed funds effective rate that really only applies to banks in these very specific situations that they're not really using in a time of stress. And it may not show stress the same way that the repo market would if there actually were funding stress in the system. So that's what she's lobbying for. Whatever. Neither here nor there. Like we said, she's not a voting member of the Fed, but I do think it's interesting that this is starting to get more momentum. And because we are in an environment where the way we did things yesterday may not be the way we do things tomorrow, we're paying more attention to articles like these than I otherwise would have 10 years ago. It would have been like an interesting thought piece. Now, knowing that she's going to be a voting member on the FOMC next year, this is the kind of thing that, hey, listen, if they made a good enough case for it, I could easily see everyone saying, okay, sure, why not? Especially depending on who the next president of the FOMC is.
Yep. Well, I will say it was funny. I sent you an article yesterday that was about how the Fed funds rate went up 1 basis point. Went up 1 basis point
to 409.
And like, it's this like huge potential issue, or like not issue, but it's this sign of stress in the system and blah, 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 blah. And I sent you this article and you were like, if you had told me 2 years ago that you would send me an article about like a 1 basis point room in the Fed funds rate and actually care. And then you were like, actually, I don't think I would care either. So
yeah, I was
so
like,
funny.
It brings me such joy that I've gotten Kristin to care about these things. And then I was like, wait a minute. It's also absurd that I care about these things now because we're so in the weeds with this. And in case you're wondering why she sent me that article, this is back to that conversation we were having about potential stresses in the funding markets. So our repocalypse conversation, the street is very split on this. So there are several banks, and this is what Bloomberg was highlighting in the article that you sent me, Kristin. There are several banks and their research departments who say, this is a big deal. Listen, we didn't get that apocalypse on September 15th, but we think that bank reserves are continuing to drop perilously low. Something needs to happen at the Fed to address this. One day it's all going to blow up. And it didn't blow up on September 15th. We've still got to get through quarter end. We still got to get all these things. It never blows up until it does. So all the catalysts that we thought could trigger that blow up didn't come to pass. It still could. And there's others out there like Matt Hornbach, whom we spoke to just over a week ago, who was like, no, we're fine. So It's really interesting because there is no hard and fast rule and how you measure that. Some people are like, oh, well, it's bank reserves relative to bank assets. Some people are like, it's bank reserves as a ratio of GDP. Like there's no formula for this. It's just when it blows up, it blows up.
Is that because basically people are like, screw you, bank. I'm not going to keep my money in the bank for 1 basis point or like 2 basis points. I'm going to put it in a money market fund and get a higher yielding income. Like, is that one of the reasons why reserves are low, or like what's the rationale for it right now?
So, I mean, bank reserves, when you think about this, let's step back. Where do bank reserves come from? It's not about the overall amount of deposits, right? It's about how much cash is in the system. Right? And where are you incentivized to put that cash? When there's no yield to be gotten anywhere and there's nothing you can do with your cash, you only have so many options. And then the Fed becomes the last place that you can go with that, right? That's what the reverse repo facility was, to put that floor on interest rates to keep them from going below zero. They are the borrower of last resorts to keep you from having to go to a bank and saying, I will pay you to keep my money with you, right? So that's where we got to. That's why bank reserves were effectively, and why there was so much cash in the system from the Fed doing quantitative easing. We've been draining that cash out of the system as we've been shrinking the Fed's balance sheet. So as the Fed's balance sheet shrinks, everything has been sucked out of the reverse repo facility and gone back into the market and gone to the places it should. Nothing should ever really just be sitting around at banks. Because if it's just sitting around at banks, the banks aren't earning money because they're not going out and lending it, right? And they're not going and buying assets if they're not lending, like treasuries or whatever, that yield more. It shouldn't just be sitting there. There's no circumstance under which that's good for anyone. But the regulators are trying to say, you need to keep all these reserves on hand in case something goes bad, right? So banks don't want to keep much more than the bare minimum that they have for that reason, right? It hurts their business model. But so when there's other things to buy, you're not just going to park your money at the bank and earn nothing. There's just
Got
other
it.
things to buy because we've been in a higher interest rate environment. There's all kinds of good stuff you can go buy. You can put it in a money market fund and still get, 4 and a quarter or 5%. So it's just a very different environment. But then all of a sudden, when you need those reserves back, it's very hard to suddenly be like, well, we want all our money back, right? We need all this cash. Well, that money's gone, right? It's not coming back.
Got it. Well, awesome. So, by the way, again, if you have not done so, I highly encourage you to sign up for the fixed income sales trading and investing masterclass that is
markets
and markets, whatever. But yeah, so that is on Tuesday, September 30th at noon, and it is going to be so much fun. I am super excited. Jen has been working so freaking hard on it. And so anyway, definitely sign up, and we will see you guys next week.
Bye.
Bye.